everyone. I've managed to solve my technical problems from last week and I'm back with another photo editing live here on Digital Photo Mentor YouTube channel. So if you haven't joined us before, I am going to be editing reader and subscriber photos to show you how I would approach them in terms of what to look for as far as editing, what kinds of things you can do with the images, and I'm going to be using Lightroom and Luminar. So if you are new to the channel, please remember to subscribe and give the video a thumbs up now so I can help more people with their photo editing. So I'm going to switch over to my main camera. Let's just do this while I switch over. Okay, can everybody see my screen? I want to make sure it's working right today. We should have Lightroom on the screen and you should see a mountain image, how's sound, and everything else. Rob, let me know if something is not working. And I'm going to start with this image here, just in terms of I did a quick before and after. So this is the what I've done so far, and this is what the before image looked like. So this was the image as it came out of camera. This is from Rajendra, and we're guessing that this is maybe if you're attending live or if you're watching this later, Rajendra. I'd love to know where this was taken because we can see some prayer flags here on the mountain. So my guess would be Nepal, India or Nepal, somewhere in that region. So if you are attending, let us know where you took this photo. So I'm going to be showing how I created that, and then I'm going to take it a little bit farther as well, right? But I'm actually going to start with a different image. We've got actually a lot of images submitted this week, so that's great. Keep them coming. I'm seeing lots of fantastic images from all around the world. Now this one, I happen to know where it was taken and who took it. So it was by Bob, and he was on a tour of India with me just over 2.5 years ago. And ironically, he took this photo a day before I took this photo, and he obviously went much later and got a sunset and a much more spectacular sky. So this is the Lotus Temple in Delhi, and I want to show you what I can do with Lightroom to spruce up punch up the sky, because there's a fantastic light here, and then we're going to take it into Luminar and take it even farther, right? If you've been watching these videos weekly, the lives, I show a tip often, and I'll just repeat it again if you are new here, where you can set what's called the white and the black point for your contrast endpoints. Okay, so if you're not used to using the histogram not only shows on your camera but also in your photo editing software, and you can use it to help you adjust the exposure. And what I'm doing here is what's called the endpoint. Okay, so what I want to do is make sure that the white is actually touching the edge of the graph on the right, meaning that I have something that's pure white in this photo. So how to do that is I'm holding Shift on my keyboard, and then I'm going to double click. Let me turn my little bubble cursor on here so you can see it. There you go. Okay, so then I'm going to double click on the word whites. Okay, and what happens is, you see how it pulled the graph over here and it increased the whites to 67, plus 67. Okay, so it's literally stretched the graph out. I'm just going to undo it and do it one more time. Now watch the graph. Okay, see how it just popped it over there? If you hold the Alt Option key when you're clicking on one of these sliders, you could see if you drag it up too far, you'll start to get clipping. Okay, so now that means it's off the side of the graph with no detail. Okay, so another way to do this besides the Shift double click is to just drag the white slider up while holding Alt Option until you get some clipping, and then slowly bring it back until you don't get clipping. And we ended up at plus 68, which is where I got with Shift double click. So now I'm going to do the same thing with black, okay? And you'll notice that it lowered the blacks a little bit. With the blacks, I actually want to have a little bit of clipping because it will increase the overall contrast of the image, okay? The next thing I'm going to do is just increase the exposure a little bit. Okay, now keep in mind that exposure actually affects the middle part of this graph. See where my mouse is here, and if I put my mouse there, it actually shows the middle part of the graph sort of highlighted, and it also gives me a left and right arrow here. So I can actually even click on this part of the graph and you'll see the exposure slider move. So watch what happens when I just click and drag. You see the exposure slider moving, and you see that it's affecting the midtones or the tempo the most. Okay, now having done that, you can see that I'm now getting a bit of clipping. Okay, so I'm just going to do the Alt Option on the highlight slider and bring it down until I get that sky controlled. But I'm not going to go all the way because I'm going to use a radial filter or a graduated filter to just affect the sky. Okay, so let's do the graduated filter. You can get to the graduated filter here, okay, or you can get to it up here. Where are we? Tools, graduated filter. I literally never go there. Okay, I use the keyboard shortcut. Okay, so when you look in here, you can see the keyboard shortcut for all of these different things. And the graduated filter is M. So I generally just use my keyboard. And when you select it, you get this little crosshairs. Okay, so you're going to drag down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the exposure really dark so that you can see where it's applying. So the further apart you pull these two lines, these three lines that you get here, the more of a fade you get. Okay, so see how, well, that was interesting. I didn't even know you could do that. Hey, I just learned something. Okay, so the more you spread these three lines apart, the softer the gradation of the filter. Okay, so it's always coming from the edge down into the middle of the image. Okay, so I actually want to pull it down to about the horizon because I want to affect the whole sky. Okay, but what's happening is it's also getting the tempo. Can you see that? Okay, so we don't want to affect the tempo, but it's done some really nice things on the sky. So what I'm going to do is turn on this range mask, which is part of the tools. Okay, so I'm going to use luminance. Okay, so luminance is brightness. Then I'm just going to check this little box here that says show mask, luminance mask. So now I can see, I'm actually going to make it less faded here because I want to get that whole sky. Okay, so I just want to cover most of the image, and then I'm going to mask it off using this luminance mask. And this range slider is the same as the histogram. So black on the left, white on the right. So I want to remove it from the dark areas. And you can see as I slide this up, it starts to remove the effect off of the temple and then off of the sky. So I want to sort of find a happy medium. Let me just turn that off. Okay, so that looks kind of weird because it's only affecting part of the sky. Okay, so let's say about there. So that looks pretty good. So it's affecting still part of the temple. If I wanted to further remove it, I could try a color mask and try clicking on the sky. Oops, I have to select the mask. Okay, so now I'm just affecting these dark blue areas, right? So that's not going to work so great either unless I keep adding to these colors. No, that's not going to work. So sometimes you don't get the perfect mask. This is not bad. It's still leaving a bit on the temple though. Okay, so I could go in and literally just paint out with the brush. Okay, so this is still inside the gradient filter. I'm choosing the brush and I'm actually going to edit where it's applying. Okay, so where you see green, or I'm going to change it to red. So the overlay is O on the keyboard to get it to show, and Shift O changes the color. So I wanted to show it in red. And what I'm going to do is go down here. So I've chosen the brush and I'm going to choose erase. Okay. And I'm going to set the flow fairly high and I'm going to set it to auto mask. So what that means is as I paint, it's going to try and find the edges of this temple, okay, and remove the effect from that area. Okay. Can you see that sort of working? And I'll do a bigger brush. And I'm just making sure that I keep my painting inside of the temple. Okay? So I don't want to get it to spill over into the sky. Okay. Zoom in a little bit so I can see it better. That's better. So if you're doing this kind of editing, generally you want to come in a lot closer like I just did here because you can't really see what you're doing when you're zoomed out. So come in closer and get these little fine edges. Okay, I'm doing still a rough and dirty job, okay? Still sort of, you know, a lot of manual work to be done here if I have to mask this off, right? And I'm going to show you an easier way to do this afterwards. And that is using Luminar, right? So Lightroom will get you there, but often it takes more work, right? And that's one of the reasons why I love to use Luminar as a plugin for Lightroom. So I still have most of my work in Lightroom, but then I pull it to Luminar to do some fine editing. Okay, so let me just turn that off. Yeah, see, I've done a kind of a crappy job of masking, and I would have to do some serious work on masking that to get that to be better, right? So I'm actually just going to undo that radial filter, and I'm going to do the sky a different way, okay? So I definitely want to keep the highlights down. And let's make sure we have nothing clipping. Okay, so we're good. I could also play with the color a little bit here. If we increase the warmth, that's the temperature slider, you get more yellow and orange. If we go the other way, we get more blue. Where it was actually pretty good, maybe a little more blue, and you could introduce a little bit more pink to that sky as well. Okay. The other way I can lower the brightness of the sky is to use the HSL panel, which is hue, saturation, and luminance. So luminance, again, is brightness. Choose this little targeted tool right here, and then I'm just going to click on the sky. Okay, so look what that's doing, right? It's only affecting, watch the sliders on the right, it's only affecting the blues, okay? If I go over here, it's going to affect the purple and magenta tones. Okay, so you have to be careful when you're doing this because this is obviously too far. That doesn't look so good. So you have to go really subtle with these kinds of things. Okay. Let's get the targeted tool again. It's not seeing a color there. How about there? There we go. Okay. So let's see what that's doing. That's doing a pretty good job. I'm just going to kind of scale it back again because I'm worried about those clouds looking too fake. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to pull this into Luminar now. Okay, so I'm using Luminar as a plugin. So I just right click and choose Edit in Luminar AI. Okay, I always want to edit a copy, so it's not editing my original. And I've already applied some Lightroom edits, so that's going to apply. It's going to make me a new file and open that inside of Luminar. Let me have a look over here. Is there any questions that I'm missing here? Yes, I saw your image fill. I've got some of Holly's as well. And excellent. Okay. Just waiting for this image to open up in Luminar. I've got Luminar open as a standalone as well, so I've got two versions of this open. And it opened on my other screen, so let me just drag that over here. Okay, so once I've opened it in Luminar, I could apply a template. Okay, so it tells me right off the bat what it's suggesting for this image. Let's see what we get here. Okay, so that's not bad. A little bit on the grainy side, a little bit overdone, I would say. So I'm just going to actually not use a template. I'm going to undo. So go back to the original. And I'm just going to use this first one here, which is Enhance AI. Okay, so I'm going to use Accent AI and just pull that up. So look what that does. It increases the saturation. It's brightening the tempo. Okay, a little bit too much saturation, but we could actually lower that in another way. So I'm going to take this part way, and then I'm going to take Sky Enhancer, because now look what happens, okay? So it's doing what I was trying to do with the graduated filter in Lightroom, but it's automatically masking the sky for me, right? So how great is that? Okay, so I'm actually going to take these a little bit farther, and I'm going to go a little over the top in terms of saturation, and then I'm just going to go down to color and dial it back. Okay, so I could dial back the overall saturation, and I could go into HSL if I want to dial that blue back a little bit more, because you want to avoid colors looking sort of overly overdone, okay, is the best word I can use to describe it. Okay, you want to keep them a little bit more natural looking. Okay, so the purples, Is it purple? Yes, it's purple. Okay, so dial that back just a little bit, like so. Okay, to see what this tool is doing, there's a toggle. Most programs, whether you're using Lightroom or Luminar, will have this type of toggle to turn a tool on and off, right? So really quickly, just applying the accent, enhance AI in the sky, and adjusting the color, we've gone from that to that, right? And I could go in and dodge the temple out a little bit more. I might want to add a little bit of structure. Okay, so structure does a really nice thing to the temple, right? You can see what it's doing all the way to the left, all the way to the right, just to see what things are doing. Now, if I like what it's doing to the temple, but not to the sky, I can just mask that. Okay, so I can literally paint it in to the temple where I want it to apply. So again, I'm going to just do a really super quick and dirty version here. Okay, so where you see the red applying again, that's where the structure filter is going to take effect. Okay, so now you can see that it is only applying on the temple. Okay. I feel like this image is a little blue now, so I have a couple of options. I could go into the light panel and give it a bit more warmth in here. Okay, so that kind of does a nice thing. That looks better. Okay, a little bit less pink maybe. Okay, something like that. Or I could also go into the creative panel down here and look at things like mood or toning. Okay, so mood is a color lookup table, or a LUT, being added to the image, like a cinematic grading type of effect. Okay, so when you pull down the list and just hover your mouse over it, you'll see what that looks going to be like on your image. So I just go through until I see one that I like. Okay, if I don't like any of these, I'll look at another option, such as toning. Okay, now I know some of these down the bottom here add sort of like a warm tone. I'm going to try the smoky. Okay, so smoky actually kind of does a nice thing, because you could also just apply it to the sky, just like we did to the other structure on the temple, and apply this just to the sky. I'm not crazy about these so much. That one's interesting. That one's not bad. Okay, so you get to decide how your image looks, and you could take it totally different directions depending on the style you pick. So I'm actually going to go with this one, right? And maybe I'll just dial it back a little bit. Toning allows you to do a different tint to the highlights and the shadows. So what I'm going to do is increase the saturation. You have to increase saturation before you see it apply, and then you could change the hue or the actual color. Okay, so I want it to be sort of in this yellow range here, and I'm going to bring it there and then just bring the saturation down again. So what that's doing is just giving me a subtle sort of boost of yellow in the shadows, because what happens is often when you're shooting on an overcast day or anything you're shooting in the shadow, when you have sun and shadow, the shadows will appear very blue. So if you do this toning trick where you add yellow to the shadows, it'll actually help it match a little bit better. Okay, and the highlights, I could decide what kind of tone I want in there. Okay, yellow looks pretty good as well there. Right, so we can take it up farther. That looks pretty good. So before and after. Okay, so it's doing a really nice job of picking up all of those details in the sky. And now I could go back and do more sky enhancer. Now that I've sort of played with the color a little bit, right? Make sure that you don't go too far on your image. So too far, what does that look like? Okay, so this one here is starting to get really grainy in the sky. Can you see that? It's starting to get really noisy up here in the sky. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of denoise and see how that goes. And anytime you do denoise, you're getting rid of noise by basically adding a blur. So anytime you do denoise, you want to make sure that you're not getting rid of too much detail. So I usually bring back some detail in the details panel that way. Okay, be careful of small details because that brings back the noise. Okay, so you're actually sharpening the noise. Let's just give this a little sharpen like that. Okay, so now we're getting pretty close. And the last one I might add is dramatic. Okay, this one literally does what it says. It adds a dramatic flair. And I can decide if I like that. Maybe put the contrast down a little bit and the saturation up a little bit. Let's see what that's doing. Okay, so that gives it another little punch. The final thing I would do here is add a little vignette. Now I can do this in Lightroom as well, but the benefit of doing it in Luminar is that I can place the vignette. Okay, so I can make it off center. So I'm just going to use the feather to 0, adjust the roundness, make it smaller, because I want the oval kind of down here around the temple. Okay, so it allows me to choose subject and move the vignette around. So see how I can just move it down like that? If I wanted to do something similar in Lightroom, I would have to use a radial filter. Okay, so the vignette tool will not work in Lightroom that way. So now I've got my feather back to sort of middle, but you want to make sure you don't do an obvious vignette like this. So adjust your amount. And let's take a look at the before and after again. Okay, so we started with something that was very pink and blue, and then as I went along, I changed my vision for this image. Okay, but the interesting part of this image is definitely the sky, and you want to bring out some details in this temple. Right? You could go another step here if you wanted to add some more sun rays, but there's already beautiful sun rays coming out of here, and I don't want to conflict with that. So I'm going to apply that, and it'll bring us back to Lightroom. Okay. One question. Should luminosity denoise be more than color noise? Yes, that is a great question. And the reason to choose, I chose luminosity noise, is I didn't see any color noise. So when you zoom in, if you see little speckles of pink and green, that's color noise. If you just see sort of black speckles, that's regular noise or luminosity noise. Okay, so only use the color one if you see those color speckles. Otherwise, you don't need to use that one. Okay, now we're back here in Lightroom, and I've got both versions. Okay, so you can see what I've done to create something completely different. Right? But the sky is definitely the star in that image, and when we go back to the original here and we look at the before, it just needs to be punched up a little bit. Right? So great capture, Bob. Just punch it up using some of those tools. Okay. All right. Next one was an image that was submitted last week by Wilma. And she photographed her parents, and I've already done some basic edits to this image. So it was a little bit dark and a little bit off color. So, excuse me. Let me just take a sip of water. Great, I'm glad that answered your question. How do you pronounce your name? Gautam? I don't want to murder your name, so help me to pronounce your name properly. So what I did here was in the basic panel here, what I've done is I've adjusted I've increased the exposure a little bit, lowered the highlights, shadows, and increased the whites. So remember that little trick? If I put the whites back where they were, okay, that's what really punches up this image. Okay, a lot of people mistakenly think when an image is dark, they need to increase the exposure. Okay, but the exposure will do mid-tones, whereas whites will keep your contrast of your image. Okay, so I think we need a combination of both here. Right, so whites ended up at plus 56, and exposure, I'm going to turn that down a little bit to keep my contrast somewhere in that range. Okay. So when I keep the whites up higher, I end up with more contrast. Okay, so now I've got the basic edit done. I also did some cropping to straighten it, okay, because I'm going based on the lines on the hearth on the fireplace here. Okay, I would have loved to get rid of this little white square at the bottom. So what I'm looking for when I'm cropping, I'll just undo this so I can show you what I've done. What I'm looking for when I'm cropping is there's parts over here, like they're fairly centered, so I want to off-center them a little bit. It's crooked, and then there's this little sort of thing at the top here. Now I could clone that out or just crop it out. So what I did with the crop tool was I just used my keyboard shortcut again. That's R, okay, or you can hit this key right here, this button right here, okay, this tool. you can click auto. Okay, auto will try and do the correction of the tilt for you, and you can see that it's done a pretty good job. And now that little thing at the top is already cropped out. And the next thing I'm looking for is I don't want to end up with these white bits kind of captured or trapped at the edge of the image. I'd rather have something dark at the edge of the image. So I'm just going to bring that in a little bit like that. Maybe even all the way to the planter. Okay. And the same thing here is I don't want to have these couple of leaves sticking out, so I'm just going to clean up the edge there. Now I'd love to get rid of this white part at the bottom, but if I do that, I'm going to be cutting off her fingers. So don't cut people's fingers off at the digits like that, okay? I would not want to do something like that or even like that, because now her arm looks amputated, right? So I definitely don't want to cut off her hand. But now they're off-centered a little bit. The image is straight, and I'm ready to take it into Photoshop. Maybe I'll add a little edge vignette. Yes, okay, so this is in my Lightroom presets. Maybe you can share that, Rob. So these are presets for Lightroom, okay, and that is done in the effects panel. So remember I talked about not being able to off-center a vignette in Lightroom, so I can show you that. Okay, so where it applies is always centered. Okay, so if I wanted to do more darkening on this side, I would have to do a radial filter, okay, which is not a problem. But for this purpose right now, I think that looks pretty good. Yes, okay, so now what she's asked me to do is, if you have a look here, her mom's lip opened a little bit, so she wants to know if I can fix this part of the lip. And I also want to comment on one thing that's not sort of fixable is lighting when you have a flash like this. Because if you look here, there's a big shadow on the background behind them, and that is caused from a flash on camera. So when you have flash on camera and they're close to the wall like that, you're going to get a shadow, and that's almost impossible to retouch. You're also going to get potentially red eye, and it will make the faces a little bit flatter. So Rob, if you could share an article from the website on bounce flash, the one that I talked about bouncing the flash, okay, that would be helpful in this case, okay? So you could bounce it off a ceiling, off a sidewall, or something like that. Phil wants to know, my first reaction is to crop before I do any editing. Is that the best process? I generally do, yes, Phil, because if I'm going to be doing cloning out or stuff, I don't want to cause myself extra work at doing a bunch of cloning and work on an area of the image that I end up cropping out later. So I do want to do the cropping. Okay. The other thing that I forgot to mention that I did here was that I changed the camera profile. Okay, so this is something that you can do in Lightroom in the basic panel up at the top. Now, if you don't see this, make sure that you're using the current version of Lightroom. I am using Lightroom Classic, okay, which is the desktop version. Okay, if you're using Lightroom CC or just what they call now Lightroom Cloud, you may not see this, or your tools are going to look a lot different. Okay, so in here under Profile, if you click these little 4 squares, you'll see that you have an option for Adobe Profiles or camera matching. Okay, now I didn't take this picture, but Adobe knows that it was taken with a Canon camera because it's a CR2 file. Okay, so if I go into look at the metadata of this file, I can see that indeed it was shot with a Canon 6D Mark II. Okay, so Lightroom knows that, and all I did was the original, it comes in, when it pulls it in, it generally goes with Adobe Color as the sort of camera profile. But look what happens when I just change it to portrait, okay? They have a lot more color. I'm just going to hover my mouse over so you can see that. See how it's changing the contrast, the color, everything? Okay, landscape gives you a lot more yellows and greens. Okay, so they kind of look jaundiced. But look at the color of his rose, and the flowers on his shirt is changing as I look at these profiles, okay? Sorry, that was a sneeze. Muted so you don't have to listen to my sneeze. Okay, so just by choosing a profile, it's changing the overall look of the image. So I will usually do that first as well. So camera profile and cropping first. Okay. Now we want to pull this into Photoshop. So I'm going to right click and go edit in. And I'm not going to choose edit in Photoshop. I'm going to choose open as a smart object, okay? And what that will do is open it in Photoshop on a layer as a smart object. So a smart object, if you're not familiar with that term, it means that whatever I apply to that particular layer in terms of filters or effects or adjustments, they're all editable. Okay, if I open it as a layer and apply softening or liquefy or anything like that, okay, it applies to that layer and cooks it in. Okay, so that's the big difference. All right, so now we're open in Photoshop. And let me just grab my layers panel from over here. So I work on 2 monitors. So usually what I do is I have my tools on this screen and my other panels on the other screen. Okay, so here you could see this little icon on the bottom of the layer, and that means that it is a smart object. Let me see here. I'll change my thumbnail. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to just do a selection of her face, because I'm going to try liquefy on this. I could try a couple of different things. I could try puppet warp, or I could try liquefy. Okay, so I don't want to do it on the entire image. So I'm going to use this lasso tool here. That's this guy on the toolbar. And I'm just going to sort of circle around. I get a larger area. And then I'm going to go up into here and liquefy. Okay, so liquefy is here, and what's going to happen is it's going to open the liquefy tool, and if I show, I'm going to zoom in a little bit here because I want to get really close to her mouth. Let's go 100%. There we go. Okay, so now we can see that. So I'm going to turn my cursor thing off here for a moment. So the tool you want to use is either this first one, okay, and the way that it works is it sort of pushes things, okay. So I'm just going to show you what it does. So when I do that, it pushes, okay, and the size of the brush matters as well. I'm just going to undo that, okay. If I have a much larger brush, for example, okay, it pushes and grabs. I'm clicking and holding, okay. So you really want to be conscious of what size of brush you're using. I'm going to get a small one about the size of her lip. Can you guys see the circle there? I don't know if that's something that you can see. So I'm going to go here and I'm just going to sort of push it down a little bit, maybe even smaller. Okay, so I'm just kind of pushing from the top and the bottom to bring her lip in a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of starting to work. And I'm probably going to have to do some cloning as well. Okay. The other one I could try is this one, okay, which looks like a weird sponge thing, and I'll just show you what it does. When I click and hold it, see how it just sort of sucks the thing in, okay? Now that one might work here on the lip, okay? So, oh, that worked nicely. Okay, maybe a little bit too much. So I'm just going to do it a little more gently. Okay, so you can see we're getting there, right? We're getting there. And then I might have to just do a little bit of cloning to finish it up. Okay, so about like that. Yeah, because anything more, I'm just moving stuff around. Okay, so let's take a look at the before and after. Okay, so it's a very subtle change, but I've done it little by little. So now I'm going to say okay. And you see what happens is now there's a sort of a sub layer below this layer with this filter. Now let's say I decided that I didn't do a very good job with the liquefy. I could literally just double click right here where it says liquefy, and it's going to open that tool again. Okay, so here we are back in liquefy. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a new layer, and often what I do, so that's this little layer up here, and I'm just going to call it cloning. Okay, so it's a blank layer. Okay, it's empty, so it sees these little squares here. Okay, blank layer. And I'm going to choose, the clone stamp tool, I think. So that is this guy right here, okay, or S on your keyboard. And I'm going to try and copy from over here and clone over to here, okay. So I'm going to use normal. When you're cloning, you actually get these blend modes as well. So I want to use normal. And I'm actually going to clone at 100% because I want it to show up immediately. Okay, so I'm just going to set my source, and I'm doing that. Let me just make a bigger thing here for you. Okay, so when you're doing with the clone tool, basically what it's doing is copying your source onto another spot. Okay, so I'm just going to give her another eye just so you can see what that's doing. So when I put my mouse over her eye and I hold my Alt Option key, this gives me this little thing here. So I'm clicking on her eye. That's now her eye is my source. Can you see that? So wherever I go with this mouse, if I click, right, now she's got a third eye. So we don't want to give this poor lady a third eye. Sometimes I wish I had eyes in the back of my head. Okay, but what it allows me to do is choose a spot over here on her lip. I'm choosing right in the middle. And then as I move it over, you can see where I'm going to paint just slowly along here. Okay, now the danger of doing that is you see that I've got now, I'm going to come in a little closer. The danger is that I've got three sort of things that look exactly the same. So you want to make sure you don't end up with something like that. Okay, so I always want to change my cloning position. Okay, let's do even this one here. Okay, so we're getting there. It's a little bit out of alignment, but we're going to fix that too. Okay, then on the last bit, I'm going to change the tool to this healing tool. Okay, now there's two different healing tools. One where you just click and it heals around the area. So if I wanted to get rid of this red spot, I just click and it heals. Okay, it looks for something in that area. So that's what I'm going to do here because I want to sort of straighten this line of her mouth out a little bit. And let's see how it does on there. Now, I was hoping that it would fill that in for me, but it's not doing such a good job. The other one is this cloning, right, healing, where it's got a source as well. Okay, so I can source from over here. And it's set to light and blend mode, which I do not want. Let's go darken, because I want to darken this part of her mouth there. Okay, so we're getting fairly close. This one is unfortunately a little bit of a difficult project. So we're getting close. One other thing I might do, because this part of her mouth still doesn't look quite right, is I could go back over here, grab that lasso tool again, and actually I'm going to grab a square tool. I'm just going to copy this area of her mouth, and if I just do Command C and Command J, oops, where's my cloning layer? Let me redo that. Okay, so I'm on this layer. I'm going to copy and paste. Okay, so some reason it is not giving me what I want. Oh, there it is. Okay, so now you can see if I turn off my base layer, okay, you can see where I've painted on her mouth. You can see the little spot, and you can see that I've copied this part of her mouth. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to invert that part by using transform. Okay, flip it vertically. Okay, so now you can really see where it is, and I'm going to move it over here. Okay, let's see, my blend mode. Yeah, so I want to get it sort of, and I need to move it on top. There we go. So I want to, this is only giving me, why is it not giving me 100%? Interesting. Okay, so what I want to do is move this guy over here. And I think what I need to do is merge these layers first. Okay, so this is trial and error, right? So I'm not perfect at this either. I'm going to make what's called a stamp layer. Command Option Shift E. Okay, so what that does then is it stamps these layers into a new one. Okay, now I'm going to copy that part of her mouth, put it on a new layer, and rotate it. So this is not an easy fix, as you can see, by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so I can sort of position this. I can rotate it until I get it to sort of match. Oh, I want to rotate. There we go. Get it to sort of match her mouth. And there's a little trick for positioning. If we change it to what's called difference, I can move this around until I sort of match her existing mouth, right? And then I'm going to mask it out. So I'm showing that little part that I want in the middle here. Okay, so I'm just going to paint in with a small brush with white. So painting with white will show that part of her mouth. Okay, so it's repeating this little wrinkle from the other side of her mouth. But let's see how we've done. Let's move that down a little bit. There we go. Okay, so before and after. Okay, let me zoom in. So before, here's her mouth, after. So this is not an easy fix by any means, but it is possible. Okay, so these are some tools that are a bit more advanced Photoshop editing. Okay. I would love to put eyes in the back of my head, Holly. Absolutely. Question 1. How do you use liquefy tool only in one area and doesn't move the areas around it? What is dehaze? So dehaze is a completely different tool, Sharon. Dehaze removes like fog and stuff. I demonstrated that one last week. Actually, no, I demonstrated it in a coffee break that I did the other day for Skylum. So I demonstrated dehaze there. Liquefy tool, I'm not sure if you saw when I started with the liquefy tool, but basically what I did was I made a selection around her face, and then when I opened it in liquefy, it can only affect that area, okay? But when you're using the things like I was using, like pushing things, it's going to pull the areas all around it, because that's what it's trying to do. Like if you're trying to slim somebody or do something like that, it has to adjust the pixels all around to make it look natural. Okay, liquefy is one that's quite tricky to use. I use it fairly infrequently. So I think I've saved that. Now I'm just going to close out of Photoshop, and what should happen is the same thing when I hop to Luminar. We will get a new image, okay, and you can see that this one is a PSD file now, okay, and let's take a look. Okay, so there we go. Right, so the original, let's get over here, versus the fixed one. Okay, so it's not perfect, but it's not bad. Right? Oh, where is Holly's question? Do you recommend we load our camera profile because it might be useful now and then? As you've shown here, mine isn't loaded in Luminar, but we have to get it from Adobe. That's a good question. I haven't loaded camera profiles into Luminar as well, so that's actually something I will look into. But I know that you can load them into Luminar. Let's hop over there. I do believe it's under optics here at the bottom. Okay. Yeah, I'm not actually sure where to even apply that. So I need to do a bit of learning on that one, Holly. So thanks for that question. I'm going to dig farther into profiles for Luminar. Right? Thank you, Sharon. You guys are all great students. All right, so let's continue. The next one, and he's probably not watching because I think it's like 1 a.m. in New Zealand. But the next one is from Linton, and he was on a tour of Vietnam with me, him and his wife. So this is an image that he took. We were walking through this small village, and this is the image I took of the same man. So interesting. Just to show you what I did with this fellow. The light outside was very bright. Okay, so we're in a situation where there's lots of contrast, right? And I did the best I could to sort of darken that outside and pull the detail down. But even with a raw file, there's very little detail there because of the huge contrast range between inside and outside, okay? So I'm going to try and do something similar here with Linton's image, right? So he is using RW. Well, let's see, what camera is that? That is a Panasonic, okay? So if you go into the metadata, you can see the camera. And once again, Adobe knows, and it has picked some for me. So let's just see what happens when I choose some different ones. They're not that different. That one looks like it has a bit more detail in the shadows. Okay, so I'm going to choose one. I'm going to choose natural. Okay, so choosing the camera profile first. Okay, now be careful of pulling the highlights down. Like actually that does a really good job just with that one slider. Is I just want to make sure it's not applying to him. Because when you deal with these sliders, okay, watch the highlight on his face. Okay, so if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that it is affecting the highlight on his nose and so on. So I don't want to do that globally. So I'm going to apply that. Let's just check my histogram here. So I'm holding that Alt Option key. Okay, so he's not clipping. So I'm just going to apply this with a radial filter. Okay, so I could use a graduated filter or radial filter. So once again, that's this tool up here in the toolbar, and I use Shift M to get to that one as the keyboard shortcut. Okay, so I'm going to do exposure -100. And when you get this crosshairs now, when you draw it, you end up with this circle. Okay, so I'm just going to keep drawing until I get this massively big circle. And then position it so that it's over the window. I'm going to turn the feather down to 0 because I don't want it to apply to him. So I'm going to try and make this as narrow as possible and try and get it off of him. Just like that. Okay, so remember, I'm just affecting the highlights, so it shouldn't matter that my fade is at 0. So now it's only affecting that window and not him. Okay, now that I've done that, I could go darken as well. I would also probably lower the clarity, which is like sharpness. Dehaze, which you were asking about earlier. Okay, so dehaze removes sort of this foggy or haziness. So if I go the opposite direction and go minus, it ends up being sort of this white mess, right? Maybe a little bit of less saturation. Okay, so there we go. And I would probably, oh, see now I'm getting that line on his arm, right? So when I've got to feather. So it is showing up on his arm. Okay, so we could do a mask to make sure that it doesn't go on his arm. Let's see if that's going to work. And maybe feather it a little bit more. Okay, that's not bad. Okay, so I don't want it to affect his arm, and I definitely don't want it to show that line, okay? So now I'm happy with that. Over here, I'm going to apply just a general edge vignette. Again, these are presets that I have created myself and are part of my preset package. And that is under the effects panel, and I've literally just applied a post-crop vignette here. Okay, so I can adjust that one and change it. Okay, so that's how it's applying. Okay, maybe I want it a little bit less round, like so. So quickly, we've gone from that to that. The other thing that I like about this fellow is I might actually do him in black and white, but now that I've dealt with this window, I'm actually going to go do the double click on the whites and the blacks, okay? Because now you see that he's actually lost some contrast. So look what's happened with the white slider. It went way up. I'm just going to bring it down so he's not clipping. And I'm going to bring the exposure up a tiny little bit, okay? Just like that. So before and after. So the effect really is to bring the, what you want to do is you want to bring the eye in towards him, okay? I'm going to add even another edge vignette filter here, and this is that graduated one again. Okay. And you can see that as I pull it in, okay, you see that? As I drag it in, it's affecting most of the stuff in the window there. Okay. I think I might convert this one to black and white. Okay. You can do that just by choosing black and white, but when you do it that way, okay, you've got this mix here. Okay, so when you go down, I'm just going to go back up to basic here. So when you're in color, okay, you see below tone curve, you see HSL and color. When you click black and white, and it's the Adobe monochrome, now you see a black and white panel and what's called the black and white mix. Okay, so what that allows you to do is the Photoshop Lightroom knows what's underneath in terms of color. So if I drag a green slider, anything that was green in the original color image will be darkened. Okay, so that's that window, his clothes. If I go orange or yellow, that's going to be his skin tone and the barn. Okay, so I can brighten him up. Okay, yellow, there's probably going to be some in him, maybe in the background. Red, that's going to be like lips and skin tone. Okay, so be careful of going too far dark with red because you'll start to get splotches. Anybody that has red splotches on their skin, you'll get that showing up. Okay. Blue, blue's not doing so much, but we can drag it down a little bit. And then as a final thing, I might do color grading. So if you have an older version of Lightroom, or if you're using Luminar to do this, this is toning, or in the older version of Lightroom, it's called split toning. Okay, so now they've called it color grading, and you have shadows, midtones, and highlights now. So you can actually do what's called a tritone, but I'm just gonna add a little bit of warmth. Okay, so again, saturation first. Then I'm going to drag it over to the yellow side. So I want to get something that's sort of like a chocolate brown. And I'm happy with that tint. And then just bring the saturation down a little bit. Okay, so what that's doing is it's just giving it that sort of really old antique look. And that fits with that image. Okay. The other thing I noticed when I zoomed in here, I'm just going to come into 100%, is that it's not 100% sharp. And that is likely because he shot it at a 50th of a second with a 43mm lens. Okay, but the issue is that the Lumix is a mirrorless 4/3 camera, so that's a 2x crop factor. Rob, can you share the article on crop factor? What is crop factor? When you have a 2x crop factor sensor in your camera, you need to keep your shutter speed double the focal length. So really to stay sharp here, Linton needed 100th of a second and an increase of the ISO to do that. Okay, so it's a little bit on the blurry side because of this slow shutter speed. Let's just take a look at my settings to see if I did any better. Okay, so I used a much wider lens, okay, which also allows me to get away with a slower shutter speed. But you can see that I shot at 2/50th and ISO 5000. Okay, so I used a much higher ISO. He's grainy, okay, but you can see that he's sharp. So this is a great example of using a higher ISO, and don't be afraid of it. I would have doubled the ISO here to double the shutter speed, okay? Also share the article on getting sharper images, please, Rob. So in the article on getting sharper images, I talk about the minimum shutter speed and focus settings. Let me see if I have some questions. Does an ND filter on the lens reduce such high exposure due to sunlight and give a better image? So an ND filter is one color throughout, okay? So it's dark uniformly across the filter. And what an ND filter does is it allows you to get a longer exposure. If you're talking about a graduated neutral density filter, meaning it's like a square one where it's dark at the top and clear at the bottom, you can do that. But for example, on the one where I did the graduated filter on the temple, if you put a graduated filter like in front of the lens here, you'll get the same problem. The top of the temple will be darkened as well as the sky. So those filters really only work when you have a straight horizon with nothing poking out above the horizon, such as trees or buildings. Okay, so if you're in a situation like this, the graduated or the ND filter is not going to work. If you're in a situation like this, same problem. Okay, ideally you want to try and avoid even getting that window in the picture in the first place. But Lynn mentioned that there was a bunch of us crowding around inside this little room, and it was hard to sort of get a position. Okay, so I had a position a little bit further to the right, and ideally if we could have moved the man away from the window, that would have helped as well. So when you're in a situation where you have high contrast like this, you just want to avoid having the window in the picture, and that will solve a lot of the problems, right? Because he's got beautiful light on his face, but it's just really, really contrasty. All right. Moving on. All right, Nigel. Nigel sent us some images this week from Bahamas, so I'm guessing this was not recently. because he's got a lot of smoke. So this one was shot last August, looks like. And he's using a Canon Rebel T7i. Okay. So again, this is a JPEG, but the camera still is recognized by Lightroom. Okay. Let's see if I can choose a camera profile. Aha, it is not. Okay, so if this was saved out, possibly it does not recognize in the camera profile, or it doesn't have the profile for this camera, which is what Holly was talking about. So then you'd have to go and find it and install it into Lightroom. Okay. Exposure settings look pretty good. The histogram looks pretty good. There's nothing here that tells me that the image is under overexposed. So I'm going to do my double shift click on whites and blacks. And then I'm just going to bring the highlights down a little bit. But what I would probably do is I want to really focus attention on this boat. Okay, so I'm going to add an edge vignette. And I'll probably crop a little bit because there's a lot of sky and there's a lot of water. And I think you don't need both. Okay, so I'm going to come in and get rid of some of that. Okay, so this works a lot better as a sort of a panoramic image. And then I'm going to do exactly what I described earlier and do the radial filter so that I'm darkening the boat. Okay. Now what happens is it applies what you did last and it applies it inside the circle. Okay. I want to do the opposite. So I'm just going to click invert and then I'm going to darken. So that's a little too much. Because I want my attention, I want the viewer's attention to go on this boat, okay? So now notice that's creating a really nice dramatic sky as well. So let's see what that's doing. Okay, turn it off, turn it on. So that's what I would do if I needed an off-center vignette, okay? So it's the same thing as a vignette, but I have more control, okay? And here I can also shift the color. I could change the saturation. Okay, I'm not going to, but anything that's outside that circle and there's a slider for here, you can apply. Okay, so I could increase the clarity if I want to punch up the sky, but I think I'm going to do that overall. Okay, so I'm going to give it some overall clarity and texture, and I'm just going to check my sliders again. So remember, it's a dance. So once I've applied that radial filter, I'm going to go back and look at, do I need to adjust overall again? Okay. So there's not much else I would do with this image. If I wanted to pull it into Luminar, I could play around with some of the LUTs and color toning there and play a little bit more with the sky to enhance the sky. Yes, sorry, ash, not smoke. Yes. All right. There's another fun one. I've got a lot of past tour members who've submitted images today, this week. So this is Trish Anderson, and she went on a tour with my tour leader partner, Daniel. And you can see the date of this was November 2019. Now, here's the funny thing. If Trish is watching, again, it's she's in New Zealand as well, or New Zealand, Australia. I think she's in New Zealand. And if she's watching, this is a fellow that I photographed a year before. So look at the guy's beard. It's the same man, right? He's got the same outfit, same beard, a year difference. Okay. So he's just got a different turban, but he's sitting in the exact same spot, right? Same little pipe that he's smoking and so on, right? So what I would do with this image, again, let's go through all of those processes that we just talked about. So changing the profile, okay? So she's shooting with a Canon as well. We can look and see which camera, 80D, okay? So Lightroom recognizes that there's different profiles here. So I could try faithful, landscape, portrait, neutral, standard, okay? So landscape actually really punches up the reds, okay? So that one's actually not bad. I'm going to choose landscape. And I literally just go through them and see which looks the best. You could also go down into some of these artistic ones that come with Adobe and see if any of these look good, okay? You're going to get sort of more color grading and toning, this type of thing. I prefer to do those kinds of things inside of Luminar because I have a bit more control over how that's applied, okay? Now, the original image that she shot was very dark, right? Really underexposed. And if I undo this settings here, Let me just undo all of these. Okay, so if I undo the settings, right, the first thing that I did was this whites and blacks again. But if I just go with exposure, I have to pull it up really far, okay, like +2. So this image is easily 2 stops underexposed. So really pay attention to when you're shooting what your exposure is. And part of the problem here is that her exposure bias is set to -2/3, okay? So Trish, if you're shooting an aperture priority, make sure that you're not set to -2/3, because the way that your camera measures, please share the article, Rob, on what happens when your snow is gray. When you're photographing something like this that's a lot of white and your camera looks at this, it's going to try and make it medium gray, okay? So if you've ever seen, like, let me just come over here for a moment. Let me just come on the screen for you here. Okay, so if you've ever seen, these are gray cards, okay? So this is a gray card. Obviously, this one's black and white. So if you shoot with a gray card, your camera is going to try and make everything this tone, the gray, okay? If something in your picture is white and your camera measures off of the white, it's going to try and make it gray, okay? So that's what's happening with this one here. Okay, so when we go back to Trisha's image, right, the scene is white, but your camera's trying to make it gray, and she's got it set to -2/3, so that's why it's that underexposed, okay? So I'm going to crank the exposure up a little bit, and then I'm going to do that shift double click on the white slider. I'm going to bring that up a little farther. I'm starting to get some clipping on the highlights of this little pipe here, but that's okay. And let's do the blacks. About like that. Right. Now there's a lot more I can do in terms of bringing the highlights down. And I want to really affect his face, because the rest of the image looks pretty good, but his face is very, very dark. Okay. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can try the shadows, but again, it's going to affect the shadows of the whole image. And I don't necessarily want to do that too far, so I'm going to bring it up a little bit. Okay, you notice that I also shifted the color temperature because he was a little on the blue side, right? And I also find that if you play around with the yellow and blue slider, okay, so to the right is yellow, left is blue. Let me just set it back where it was. If I add a bit of yellow, you'll find that often you need to add a bit of green as well, okay? Because magenta and blue are cool, yellow and green are warmer, okay? So I want to make him a little bit warmer. Now I could use a radial filter and lighten his face, okay? So Shift M, create the circle on his face, right? So remember, it's going on the inside. And the radial filter comes with a bunch of presets. Some of these are made by Lightroom. Some of these I made myself. I do believe this one is in Lightroom. So dodge face. Okay, so dodging means lightening. Okay, so if I choose dodge face, look what happens. You know, I've actually altered my settings to increase the whites, the shadows, and decrease the blacks. Because I find that when you just increase the exposure or the shadows, let me show you the difference, okay? So if I lower the whites and I just increase the shadows, you end up with something that's sort of flat looking, okay? So I usually do a combination of all three, okay? So look at how, excuse me, look at how this is increasing his brightness, and I've got the overlay just on his face, okay? So I can rotate it or make it a little bit bigger if I want, because I don't want it to apply to the wall, okay? So that's doing a really nice job. And I could even add some warmth, like if I decide, okay, his face needs to have a little bit more yellow or less pink, we can do that just into that area, right? The other thing that I've noticed is that overall, again, there's that sort of weird tint to the shadows. So we could go down here to the color grading. And the way that I applied it before to add the sepia tone, right, I could do something similar here in sort of the yellow area, yellow-orange, just to add to the shadows to get rid of that blue, okay? So let me see what that's doing. Toggle that off. Okay, it's very subtle, but you'll notice that it's picking up. Let me increase it a bit here. it's just making it look less blue, especially in the shadows, right? I could play with that as well in his outfit, okay? But I think I'm happy with where that's at from Lightroom, okay? The other thing that I did with this fellow on my image, right, was I pulled him into Luminar. I applied a texture screen and a color LUT as well. So similar to what I did on the first image of the temple, I made this one look really sort of like it was taken, 100 years ago, right? So I've made it into a matte finish, and I might do something like that here as well. Okay. Any questions? Nope. Okay. So I'm going to pull this guy into Luminar, and I'm going to do a quick edit on him. And the other thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to go with a smaller color space just for purposes of quicker demonstration here. Is there a keyboard shortcut to turn on off a Lightroom effect instead of the button? No, Mike, there isn't. The keyboard shortcut for before and after is a backslash, but that's everything. The only way to turn off one of the effects is the little toggle button, right? So you have to just do that. It's the same in Luminar. When we get to Luminar, I can do the before and after of everything, or I can do before and after of one tool with the toggle switch. Okay, so I've got 2 Luminars again. Okay, there it comes. All right. So I actually have some templates that I've saved and created, and I've got one called Turkish Faded Sepia Look. Okay, so that's kind of what I want here. So I'm just going to try that one and see what it does. And these are just ones that I've created myself by using a previous template or one that Luminar suggested and then altering it a little bit. Okay, so look at that. That's pretty close to what I ended up with. So I'm going to start there. I could also dial this down using this little slider at the bottom. Okay, so I could kind of just lower the effect a little bit if I wanted to. Or you can go and edit from here and you can see what my template has done. So anything with a dot beside it has been applied. Right, so it has applied that mood and toning that we talked about. The matte look also. So matte means that when you have a black in the image, it starts to look sort of like not solid black, right? It's more of a gray tone. Okay, so that's what matte finish looks like. And we've applied some face and skin AI. I think the only other thing I'm going to do is I did apply some details, it looks like. And I'm just going to check the mask on this one, right? So because this was from a previous template, I've masked this one. So I'm just going to clear it and paint it in on him because I want to give some details to him to bring out our attention, especially to that beard. And he's got a fantastic expression. Like, look at this guy. I love this guy. It's no wonder that he sits and he's happy because he's sitting and smoking his pipe all day, right? He's got some happy joy juice in his pipe or something. Okay, so we could do that, and that's going to increase the details on him. Right, maybe a little bit on his hands as well. And I find that the small details slider here will really help with an image that actually is a little bit out of focus. So I could have run lintons through here and see if that would help as well. So look at his face. Look what's happening when I'm turning this on and off, right? Look at the detail. It looks a little blurry, and now with the details enhanced, he's really sharp. Okay. If I want to apply the texture to this one, right, I'm going to go apply under local masking. Texture. Okay, so I have to load a texture. And I've got a few that I've loaded in here. Where are they? Textures. So I've got some that are paper. And these are ones that I found on the internet. We have a set of Cuban textures as well. Let's try something like this, just for speed of. Right, so when it pops in, it comes in at 50% opacity, normal blend mode. I usually tend to use screen or overlay But in this case, I'm finding that darken works a little better. You can flip the texture. That one looks pretty good. Right? And I can also decide if I want to mask it so that it's not applying on him. Right? So I can say, okay, I don't want it on his face, but maybe I want it on his clothes. Yeah, I'm going to put it back. So you can literally just paint in and out. So there's the erase and the paint tool. So I don't want it on his face, but I do want it on his shirt. Okay, so that's giving me a really nice old effect. Maybe I want to lower it just a little bit, the opacity. And there we go. Okay, so once we're happy with that, and that was just a template, a couple of tweaks of a couple of tools, and adding a texture, and we're back to Lightroom. Anne's got to run. I have one of your images, Anne, so make sure you pick it up later because I'm going to do your ballerina image next. So do watch the replay later. Anne sent me an image from Cuba. So Anne is another one of our tour members. Right, and there is the edited image. Okay, so when you are working with Luminar as a plugin, you end up with your version you had in Lightroom and then a new version that you've created. Oh, Anne's going to stay. Okay, I'll do yours next. Okay, so thanks to Trish for sending that in. All right, so Anna's the ballerina's name is Anna as well, so I get confused. So Anne sent in this image, and this was our last tour that we did last January before all this craziness started. And we were photographing this ballerina. That's my photo in the same room, and there's sort of an overall showing everybody else taking pictures. So we're all trying to stay out of each other's photos. Tricky to do when there's a mirror in the room. And I don't know if you noticed or not, Anne, but there's a ducky hanging on the armoire door there, and I kind of don't mind it. Right now, notice that she's focused on the girl, not on the armoire. Okay, so when you're dealing with a mirror and you're photographing something in a mirror, you actually need to photograph on the image in the mirror. Okay, not on the mirror or on the wall itself, because what happens is if she is 4 feet away from the mirror, you're actually focusing 4 feet behind the mirror. Okay, you didn't see the ducky? Yeah, I know. I actually didn't see it on mine image either, but here he's kind of lit up. So let's work on this one. Okay, so this is another CR2 file. Lots of Canon shooters today. I'm going to try portrait. Let's see. Actually, landscape gives me the nicest color. So I'm going to go with landscape because the blue wall really shows up nice. And I think I've already got some stuff clipping, so I'm not going to increase the whites. We're going to bring the highlights down a little bit. And I'm using that Alt option. Okay, so I'm just bringing the details into that window a little bit. And I'm going to make sure that I've got some nice black. Okay. Now I'm going to correct, it feels like it's tilting, so I'm going to use the crop tool and auto and see how it just kind of corrected the tilt a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go even farther than that. Now, if I think that that's not done a good job, there's another way that you can do it with the crop tool, and that's this little ruler here. So if you click on this little ruler, it gives you this little sort of ruler and a little crosshairs. So I'm going to click in the middle of this pattern on the mirror and then down to the bottom in the middle. And what it should do is where my line is, it's going to make that line perfectly up and down, perpendicular. Okay. So I'm happier with that crop. So I'm going to apply that. I'm going to darken with a graduated filter. So what I'm looking at now is I see things that are distracting, and that's this bright bit at the top and the bottom. So how I'm going to fix that is a graduated filter coming in from the edge, right? So once again, more fade, right? And I'm darkening the highlights, so it's really affecting that wall. And I could probably even go overall darker. Now that kind of picks up the duck as well. So if I want to leave the duck and not darken him, we have two choices. I could pull my graduated filter back a little bit, which works. Or I could just use the brush on this tool and just erase it a little bit so that our little ducky still has highlights. Okay, so now if you see where the See how I've just sort of removed it from him, right? So the mask is where the green is. That's where the tool is applying, right? Just like that. Maybe make that a little thinner. And actually, because I'm affecting the highlights, I could actually pull it in right up to, whoops, right up to her, so that it affects that window a little bit more as well, like that. There we go. All right, so that's just darkening that edge. So again, everything I do is to bring attention and focus on the subject. So she is clearly the subject. She's well lit, but when we look at her, look at the before, there's lots of bright areas around her, just taking attention away ever so slightly, right? So that's kind of all I would do on this one. We could do some noise reduction. It's shot at 2500 ISO. It's a little bit dim in the room. So she's got some good settings here. And I've got a preset for noise reduction and sharpening. Right? So that's before and after a little bit of noise reduction and sharpening. Maybe share the videos for Sharpen AI and Topaz Denoise if you're interested in some plugins that do a really fantastic job. They work with Lightroom and Photoshop. You can use them with Luminar, but you have to just export your image from Luminar, go run it through Topaz, and then re-import it back into Luminar. Okay. Cropping. Yes, I might crop this one. I debated that. Taking off some of the floor because the stripes on the floor are a little bit distracting, but I don't want to lose sort of the fact that she's in the mirror. The other way I thought about doing it was sort of a tall vertical like this and leaving the floor and doing something like that. So tall vertical. The only, like I said, the only problem is that little corner. Oops. The only problem is that corner down here. So I could just do another graduated filter and darken this corner. Okay. So see how I'm just affecting that corner like that. Okay, so before, after. Does that help? Should we use flash on camera in such a dim light situation? Flash would generally put a hard light on the subject. Yes, it would. And there was beautiful light in the room, so we didn't need to use the flash. Also, there was like 6 people or 5 people shooting in a small room, and if we're all trying to use flash, we'd end up having flash in each other's photos. So when you're in a, this was from our Cuba tour workshop, you'll end up overriding. If I was shooting myself in this room, I would probably use a flash on camera, but bounce it. Okay, if you can share that bounce article again for Guatem, that would be applicable here. So you want to work with the flash, but have a direction, because when you have it on camera pointing directly at the subject, yes, you will get flat. Yep, flat and hard. Getting more ideas in Lightroom. So the only other thing that I would do potentially with this one, Anne, is I've got another nice little template that I saved in Luminar, and that would be to just give it a color toning, right? So I love Luminar in terms of adding these antique looks. It can do the same or similar thing inside of Lightroom minus the textures. Okay, you cannot add a texture in Lightroom because it's like a layer effect. Okay. We're going to take a break after this one because I have to go to the bathroom. So we're opening this one in Luminar. Other Luminar. Sorry guys, just waiting for it. Any questions while I'm waiting for this to... See you next weekend. Thanks for sending your image. There we go. Okay, so let's look at my templates again. Let's see. This is one of my favorite ones, this nostalgic haze. Okay, so it actually gives it more grain, and that's kind of effective on this image. Even just some of the ones I've saved in my favorites. Well, that's very different. Let's see. There's one that I'm looking for. I think it's nostalgic haze. Yeah, this is the one I would probably use on this one. Fade. There's a ballerina one I made before. Okay, no, not that one. Let's try that one. We can also see what Luminar suggests for us. Influencer. This one might be interesting. I think for me, like what I'm looking for and what I have in my head for this image, again, is something maybe slightly faded out. Ooh, experimental might be cool. The experimental collection has these light leaks, which is kind of neat, right? That kind of fits with the mirror. Ooh, that's nice. I like that. Yeah, let's go with this one. That's kind of cool. So it's added this really cool color. And again, using the templates, you can then sort of dissect and see what it's done. Okay, so here it's lowered the smart contrast. In color area, let's have a look at what it's done here. It's done lowered the saturation of the reds. That's about it there. Looks like it has lowered the details, so it's applying sort of a softening look to this image. It's applied this mood, right? So that's that cold frame. Okay, so if I don't want the cold so much, I could dial that back a little bit or pick a different LUT, right? But I think that that's actually a really cool kind of effect. And where it's applied is as a texture. Okay, so you can flip it up and down. Let's try. That's actually kind of neat. You can also, like, I don't like this little red one at the bottom. Okay, so I can just say I'm going to mask that guy out. I don't like this one at the bottom. So I don't like that one so much. Or if I want to make sure that it's not on her face and on her, right? Make sure that she's nice and clear, like so. So this is just an idea, remember? I find that a lot of times these templates in Luminar, like I wouldn't have thought of putting these light leaks, but with the mirror, right, it very well could have caught the light and you get sort of these sparkly things. And it works with a ballerina, I think, really well. All right, so I'm going to save that and hop back over into Lightroom, but we're going to take a short break because I need to use the bathroom. So come back, grab a coffee if you want, and we'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, I'm back. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. That would help us a lot. So let's get back to editing. Here we go. Okay, this is one I did last week actually. Let's get back to Lightroom. So there's our finished ballerina photo. So Anne can have a look at that one later, see what she thinks. I could edit this one probably several different times and come up with different ideas for it every time. Okay, let's get to this one that I showed at the very beginning because I started editing this one from Rajendra. And I'd love to know where this was shot. It's a beautiful image. Okay, now it's a raw file. And what I did to get here was I did the camera profile again. Okay, and then I also went to the very bottom here under calibration. So this is something that a lot of people rarely use. So I'm going to turn this off. So this is where you set your version of Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. Right? But it also allows you to shift some of the colors, okay? So watch what happens when I turn this on, okay? So see how more intense the greens are and the overall image is less red. And I've done that by shifting all of these colors here, okay? One other thing I want to show you is lens corrections. Now I haven't turned these on yet. I turned on actually chromatic aberration and the camera profile, okay? So you'll notice that chromatic aberration may show up around the edges, but the profile, okay, eliminates things like darkening in the edges that the lens does. So some lenses, okay, so this one is a Nikon 18 to 35. Okay, so Lightroom knew that that was the lens that you have used on a Nikon D800, okay? That some lenses naturally have some edge darkening or vignetting, okay? So what that's doing is compensating, and you can see that it's also sort of stretching it out and minimizing some of that wide angle distortion, okay? Now if you want to keep that distortion, you can do so here, okay? Or you can increase the amount of correction. You know, one thing I want to call attention to here is, go back to lens correction. There's these darkening in the corners, okay? Do you see that? And when I turn this off, okay, you can see that it's much worse. And if actually, let's go to 33%. Okay, so you can see that there's this weird darkening on the corners, and I have an idea what it is. Okay, so I could try dialing the vignette up a little bit more, or I could try dialing the distortion up a little bit more to get rid of it. Right, now that actually does the job nicely. Right, so the other option would be to crop the image, because what I think is happening here is that there's maybe a filter been applied to the outside of the lens. I can't tell from, you know, when this was shot, but it was 2 seconds at f/22 at ISO 100. So based on that exposure, I'm going to take a wild stab and guess that there was a neutral density filter applied. And when you're dealing with a wide image, like a wide lens like 18, if you put a filter on that's thick, you may actually end up seeing the edges of the filter on the corners. And I think that's what's happening here. Okay, so in order to solve that, we could either crop in a little bit, or I can just increase this distortion correction until I get rid of most of that. Okay, can you see that? And the vignettes a little bit. Okay, so combination. So really be careful if you're using a super wide lens that you're not getting what's called cutoff on the edges from your filter. And if you do, you need to buy what's called a low profile filter. So the filter itself is actually thinner, okay? Or if you have a UV filter and you put that one on top, take off the UV filter when you put on the other one, okay? So that's what's causing the corners there, okay? To get back up into basics here, so I've done some highlight, shadow. I'll just undo this and so you can see what I've done. Okay, so I've just created that punchiness using the blacks and whites corrections that I showed you before, the shift double click, and adjusting the highlights and shadows a little bit, okay? The other thing that I did apply was a graduated filter to the top. And what I'm doing there is affecting the sky because it was far more blown out. So I wanted to pull that detail down a little bit. But I found that if I pulled it too far, it actually just sort of got muddy. Okay, so I want to leave it there, and we're actually going to try a sky replacement in Luminar instead. Okay, the other one is I applied a darkening at the bottom because this right corner here was really light, and if I turn this filter off, okay, so you can see those rocks on the bottom right are just really light. Okay, so I wanted to darken the edge to bring your eye into the water. Okay, I might crop this one a little bit as well. Okay. Partly because I feel like there's a third of the image has this sky and this canyon, but for me the image is about the water flowing over these rocks and this valley here. Okay, so for me the image is more about maybe like that. Okay, so now we've got 2/3 of the image with rocks. We get rid of some of this stuff on the right as well, and focus in on the valley itself. Okay. The other thing I want to point out is that you've got some nasty dust on your camera sensor. Okay, so these black spots right here, okay, you can see them here and here, are dust on your sensor. Okay, so when you're shooting at f/22 like this one, okay, any dust that you have on your sensor or any dirt on your lens is going to show up, okay, because this could be on your lens as well. So always make sure when you're shooting at small apertures like that to clean your sensor and clean your lens. If you're not comfortable with cleaning your own sensor, find a camera store or something locally that will do it for you. So to clean this up, I'm going to use the clone and heal tool. I'm going to use healing at 100%. And there's this little thing here. I activated the toolbar, and that's T. Okay. You can then click visualize spots. Okay, so when you do that, you can actually see, I'm going to turn my cursor off. You can actually see where the spots are. Okay, so I'm just going to click, and Lightroom will find a spot to repair it. Okay, there's another one up here. I'm just going to turn the visualize off. Yeah, see there's another one up here in the actual mountain. Let's see how good a job it does there. So I recommend doing smaller little spots. This one here sort of on the edge of the mountain. Okay. Make sure it's choosing the right place. So if Lightroom chooses the wrong spot, let's just do an example. So if I click here, okay, it's choosing that spot, but maybe I want to choose that. So you can just grab this source. Okay, so you can see that there's an arrow, right? So it's cloning from there to there. Okay, so that's gotten rid of some of our spots. Okay, take a look to see if there's any others. There might be some up in there hiding in the clouds. So that's where that visualize spots comes in handy, because you might actually miss some. Okay, and sometimes what I'll do when I'm using this tool is actually just darken the whole image. Okay, because look, now that I've done that, I can see one more spot right there. So I'll just darken the image so that I can see where these little blobs are, so that I can get rid of them. Okay. Now this one is a little blob along the horizon here. Let's see if I can fix that. Okay, and then just put this back where I had it. Okay. About like that. All right, so now what I will do is take this one into Luminar, because like I said, I could try and pull out some detail out of this sky, but it's not going to do a great job. It'll still be fairly muddy. Okay, you can also clone out these wires. Okay, so I'm going to do a better job of that. I could probably do it in here, but what happens is I find that Lightroom just isn't equipped. It doesn't have the best cloning tool, right? So I can draw, you can see where it's pulling from, and do it sort of, I recommend if you have things like this, do it section by section. Don't try and do one big long swipe. Okay, so I can get rid of most of the wires by doing this. Okay, and I'm doing one at a time, section by section, moving it over. Oops. Undo. Now I'm being careful not to touch the trees here, and I'll show you why in a moment. Okay, because the part that touches the trees is the tricky part. Okay, so I'm just going to zoom in closer. So you can see there's still a little bit left there. So I want to click on that spot, and then I have to choose carefully where I position it, okay? Because I want to sort of make sure that the tops of the trees look replicated. And if Lightroom doesn't do a great job of it, I'm actually going to try it either in Photoshop or in Luminar and see what Luminar does. Okay, so that's not bad, but it's not great. Okay, it's left kind of a halo. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to see what kind of job I can do in Photoshop and Luminar. So this one I'm going to edit in, and I'm going to go to Photoshop as a smart object again. So if you were watching earlier when I did the one with the liquefy and I used a smart object, I'm going to do the same thing. So because I want to do two different things on this one, and I want to be able to have the option of coming back to it later, I'm going to do it as a smart object so I can do the cloning, and then I can also go in and apply the Luminar edits. Okay. Should be opening. Here we come. Photoshop's thinking about it. Take care, Nigel. Good luck with the cleaning up process. I can't imagine what that's like. Be safe. Okay, so now we have this image in Photoshop, and it is a smart object layer, right? So I'm going to do the same thing I did before, and I'm going to do new layer, and I'm just going to call it cloning. Then I'm going to zoom in, and I'm using Command plus to zoom, depending on whether you're using Mac or depending on the kind of, oh, see, look, I've already found another black spot right there. So I'm going to use this guy. Let's see how that does. That looks pretty good. So I'm finding more of these little sort of spots from the sensor all over the image. All right, so I'm going to use the healing tool, the one that allows me to sample a spot. So I'm going to sample right next to the wire. I'm going to make sure that it's set to lighten, because I want to, the thing that I'm going to be going over is lightening the wire. Okay, so as I paint, it should just get rid of the wire. Okay. And sometimes I recommend like sampling again from a different spot so that you don't end up with sort of mirror images of the same thing. All right, so let's just make my spot a little bigger. Here's another little trick. If I go from one end to the other and I hold shift click, it should follow that straight line. Okay, so see how that did that? So I click once there, go to the other end, hold shift, click, and it did a nice job there. Okay, so that's doing a pretty good job. Let's see. So it's sampling. I'm making sure that I'm using current and below, and I'm using sampled. Okay, so that's perfect. All right, so I'm just going to go over that a little bit more. Okay, now once I get down to here, I'm going to resample. Okay, let's see if I can still see that wire. All right, so you guys are giving me some more challenging images today. This is good. All right, so we're going to do that again. And I'm just going to do that. So I'm going to resample. I can still see the wire just a little bit. All right, getting close. Now I'm going to switch over to, well, let's see how it does. Okay, so if I clone from over here on these trees, so my sampling is from there, source, and I go over here, so you see what it's doing? It's going to clone that tree in. Okay, so I'm going to go there, and then as I move up, it should get rid of that. That's not bad. All right, let's see if we can do the same thing over on this tree. So I'm going to sample here again, go over to where I want it to go. Right, so I find a lot of times you're not going to get a quick fix, and a lot of times people want something, done immediately, and that's not going to happen, right? Let's see. Let's try this one again. My mouse is very sluggish right now. How's my audio sync today, Rob? Let's do that sample again. Okay, up the wire. Now I'm going to take forever to do this, so you've got the idea here. I'm not going to continue. Okay, but what you want to do is build it slowly, and then when you get to this point where it's at the trees, you need to select what you want to clone into that area, okay, and really be specific about it, because you want to make sure that it looks like it's blending naturally, right? I could also use the stamp tool, right? So clone and stamp, set to lighten, so it's not ever going to add anything darker. Set to 100%, and let's just see about fixing up this rest of this wire real quick. There we go. Still got a little bit over here. All right, let's try from over this side. So I'm not getting rid of it there. There we go. All right. So now when I zoom out, okay, we've mostly got rid of those wires, okay? So that looks pretty good. Now I want to do, again, this what's called a stamp layer, okay? And the keyboard shortcut is Command or Control Alt Option Shift E, okay? And that's 4 keys, and that makes you this new layer, okay? And what I'm going to do with this new layer is turn it into a smart object again. So I'm going to right click it, convert to smart object. I think I'm running out of computer resources here. I'm just going to close this Luminar version right now. Okay, and then I'm going to evoke the Luminar plugin as a filter. Okay, so under filters in Photoshop, because I've installed it as a plugin, you'll see down here it says topaz or skylum and topaz. So if I wanted to do the denoise or denoise or sharpen, you don't want to de-sharpen, Skylum software, Luminar AI. Okay, so I'm going to open it. If you have Luminar 4, it does sky replacements as well, but it doesn't do reflections. Okay, now in this case, the water's moving quite quickly and it's a long exposure, so I don't think there would be a lot of reflection in this water, but we can see what Luminar picks up. Okay. Any questions while I'm waiting for that to open? How is everybody doing? So I'd love to just, if you're watching live, just put in the chat. If you're getting value from this, just say woohoo or something like that, so I know that you're enjoying this. So I'm going to go straight into edit and into the sky replacement, because I know that I want a new sky. So Luminar should pick it up. I think it's just opening, hopefully. Oh, interesting. It is not picking up that I have a sky, so that's interesting in itself. We cannot do a sky replacement. Aha. Let's try a template. Now I've got one where I know that the sky replacement is applied automatically. Okay, so it definitely applied a toning, but not the sky replacement. All right, well that's interesting. The other thing then we can do is try a Photoshop sky replacement. So there is a new tool inside of Photoshop, and it's under, and I haven't played with it a whole lot, and it is under, I believe it's under the new neural filters, I think. Let's find out. There's a new search under Photoshop. Sky replacement. See, I can find that. Aha, edit. So now you can find things under Photoshop search menu. All right, let's have a look at this. So we've got sky replacement. We can choose a sky. So it did a better job of choosing the sky here than did Luminar, which is interesting. I've had it go both ways. I've had some where Luminar does a much better job than Photoshop did. Right, now it looks like they've got some skies already built in here. Let's try this one. You have to really match the sky with the landscape, because you don't want a sky that's dramatic if your landscape is sort of cloudy. Okay, so that's not bad. If we zoom in a little bit here, you could see that the sky is coming over top of this mountain, right? So I'm going to try and adjust it a little bit so we can shift the edge. Let's shift it up or down. That's a little better. Let's do that. And it should give me a way to paint things in or out as well. Again, I have not played with this a great deal in Photoshop. Okay, so let's try and fix that area. Yeah, it's not doing a great job there. So the benefit of this though is it outputs it to a new layer so that I can just mask it. Okay, so when it comes out to a new layer, right, just turn that one off. So there's the new sky, and I can just continue to mask it with black to remove it from this part of the sky, right? From the mountain here. Oops. Oops. Too many undos. There we go. I'll just paint right on here. Oops. See, now my paint mode is normal. See, I make mistakes too. This is not doing what I want here, so let's just turn that on and off. Okay, so see, it's coming way over into the mountains here, and it shouldn't be doing that. So it's definitely something that we need to sort of mask off here. So I'm going to play with Photoshop's tool a little bit more because I'm not super happy with what it's done. But there's a general, you know, I'm masking it off sort of really quickly. So the benefit of doing this in Photoshop with their sky replacement is it gives you a layer which then you can mask manually, right? I do find that it doesn't give you a reflection. I do find that Luminar's works better in most cases, and when it finds the sky, which it did not do in this case. So I'm going to play around with that a little bit more. So now I'm just going to save it and bring this one back into Lightroom. All right. What's the ideal computer laptop configuration required for working with such high resource consuming softwares? I'm a professional, and you can group me into hobby photography learner. Whew, that was a tongue twister. Ideally, like, you want your computer to have as much resources as possible. So let me just come over to my screen here so you can see me. Ideally, you want your computer to have as much resources as possible. So max out the amount of RAM. I have 64 gigs of RAM. Max out the hard drive. I have 2 terabyte SSD drive internally on my laptop, and none of my images live there, just my apps and my documents. You want to have a fast processor and also a fast graphics card. Okay. Now keep in mind, while I am doing this, I am running a program called OBS, which is then streaming out live into YouTube. So I'm pulling a lot of resources in addition to just photo editing, right? So plus I have the chat window open. So normally when I'm doing these things just in Lightroom or Luminar, there's not as much of a delay as what you're seeing here because I'm maxing my resources out. Okay. Holly, this is making me happy that I use Luminar AI. Woohoo! It's also good to expose myself to Photoshop and Lightroom. The concepts of editing workflow is similar, so it comes down to what you're comfy with. Yes, absolutely, 100%. And one of the reasons that I recommend Luminar, especially for beginners, who anybody that hasn't used Adobe products before, is that it's much easier and user-friendly to learn, and it kind of makes photo editing fun as opposed to starting off and being frustrated right off the bat. You can come out and just click a few templates and get some really great looking images, and then as you learn more about the editing image process, you can expand and use the tools more. The editing image editing process. Okay. So here we are back in, I'll share my screen again, back in Lightroom, And I think I've just got one more image that I want to do today, and that was another architectural one. I've actually got a couple of hollies. I've got your flower. Let me see if I can get the flower as well. Okay, so we've got this one from Sunil. They sent 2 different images, and I'm guessing this is a temple in India somewhere, because it's very similar to some that I've seen there. It's very intricate and beautiful. So what I would do with this image, when you're dealing with architecture like this, I would do some corrections for the lens corrections. Okay, now notice that I did not apply the camera profile, but the Sunil had already applied one. Okay, so standard 4 has already been applied to this image. Okay, so compared to the Adobe one, okay, so that's Adobe color. So if you're getting stuff out of your camera that you're not happy with, right, try your camera specific profiles, because look at Vivid. Look at how great that is, and I hardly have to do anything, right? If we choose landscape, same thing. So let's go with landscape here on this one, right? And just by choosing that profile, it's already, you know, a whole bunch better. So I'm going to correct the any sort of sideways tilt first with that auto in the crop tool. So you can see that it looks for not only horizontals but vertical lines, and tries to make sure that everything is level. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but it looks pretty good. Okay, if you click on it, you'll see more squares. So I think maybe I'm just going to come back a tiny little bit, but it looks pretty good. And if you want to cycle through different overlays, when you're in the crop tool, just press the O key again and again. Okay, so that's like the Fibonacci sequence swirl. You can see different croppings like 5x7. You can see the grid, or you can get the thirds. Okay, so the thirds is generally the one that comes up most often, and what I use as the default. Okay, so first is a tilt correction. Then I'm going to go down into lens corrections. Make sure I've got the chromatic aberration turned off. This was taken with a 45mm lens f20. Okay, I don't know that there's any chromatic aberration. Oh, there's a tiny bit. I don't know if you can see that. Let me see if I can zoom in to 200% here. So what I'm looking for in terms of chromatic aberration is a very tiny color fringe of usually purple on one side. Okay, so I'm just going to click that. Do you see that that went away? And then the lens profile. Okay, so when I turn that off, there's a ever so tiny purple outline around the edge of that dome, and just checking that remove chromatic aberration gets rid of that. Okay, transform is the next one I'm going to do, and this is where it's going to start correcting perspective distortions. Okay, like when you're looking up at a building, specifically tall ones. Okay, so I'm going to click auto first of all and see what it does. Didn't look like it did anything. And then I'm going to click vertical. Let's try that again. No upright correction found. Okay, so it looks like it's already corrected. So it seems like what I did with my crop did the good job. So I'm going to undo the crop and let's see what it can do now. Nope. So according to this, everything is perfectly level. So we're going to put that crop back. Now it cannot straighten this photo. Interesting. Interesting. This worked for me earlier. Let's try the other one. Okay, so this is the other image they sent. All right, let's try the camera profile on this one. Okay, so sometimes things go weird on me as well. If things happen that are a little bit weird, either close the program and relaunch it or reboot your computer, because sometimes things just happen. It's the weirdest thing. Okay, now we're going to try transform and try auto. There we go. Okay, so see how it's now sort of brought the top of the building to be more square up and down, right? So when I put on this, when I put on this crop tool, okay, you could see that everything is straight in all directions. Okay, let's try it on this one again. Maybe it's this profile that's messing that up. Let's try this. Okay, so auto. No, it does not want to correct this one. So it thinks that this one is correct. Right, so that one has done a really nice job correcting. See how the top of the building looks like it's leaning away, right? So all I've done there is change the camera profile and corrected some of the tilts. There's not a lot to do on this image. I would probably just decrease the highlights a bit to bring out some of the detail in that great architectural structure. And one other tip that you can use when you're shooting this is that this looks like it was shot sort of almost midday, right? If you look, there's no shadows in the front here. And the shadow looks like it's coming from directly overhead, okay? So when you're shooting, you want to try and get where something is like this, where it has two sides of a square, that one side is in the light. Let me turn on my little mouse cursor. That one side is in the light and one side is in the shadow. Ideally, you know, the front of the building would be lit and this side would be in shadow, right? So you want to shoot later in the day. Let's see if this tells me what time you were shot at. Okay, according to this, it was shot at 9 p.m., but I don't know if their camera was set correctly. So you want to shoot either late in the day or early in the day so that the sun is lower on the horizon and you get more of that side lighting, okay? Because then you'd have a building that shows more shape, because this is two-sided building, but it looks flat, right? Great detail, great subject, and perfect exposure, everything is great. I would just go back and try and shoot it with a little bit more dramatic lighting. Okay, the last one I'm going to do today is Holly's, just for something a little bit different. And I am going to do hers in Luminar because that's what she uses. So I am actually just going to open Luminar directly. Okay, so I mentioned that you can use Luminar as a plugin or as a standalone. So far what I've been doing is using it as a plugin. But when I open it as a standalone, let me close Photoshop. So I've got more resources available here. Right, when I open it as a standalone, it's going to do the same type of thing where I see all the thumbnails and so on. Okay, so here it comes. And let's see. All right, there's the flower. Okay, so you can see all the thumbnails. You can see the ones that I've already worked on today, right, and so on. So I'm going to start with the workflow up at the top. So Luminar has a suggested workflow. Okay, so from catalog to templates. And when you get to templates, again at the top, these are suggestions. So the first one it's now suggesting is nature. Yes, okay. So let's just see what those do. Ooh, sunny small looks good. Okay. Ooh, that one's kind of grainy. So what I am envisioning for this image is possibly something even soft color, maybe blurring out the background even farther, or maybe even a texture screen. Okay, so that one is actually kind of nice. Let's see what else it suggests. Filmatic and objects. Let's see what it has under objects. Okay, perfect macro. Let's see what it's doing before and after. Okay, so that's the after, that's the before. So it's giving me more color. That one's punching the contrast. So I think most of these are going the opposite direction of where I wanted to go. Now remember earlier, let me see if I have in my favorites here. No, I don't. Remember earlier, the one that I applied on the ballerina was the experimental, and it's under portrait, okay? But this one here might look really good with this image, because any of these with these light leaks, because we've already got sort of some sparkly bokeh in the background, and we can just work with it, right? So I think that this is a nice place to start, right? That one's giving us this orange glow. That one's a little much. That's kind of cool. This one is like black and white with color faded. Let's see what that one's doing. All right, so I like a lot of these and what they are doing here, right? And the neat thing about this is, again, we can go and edit it. So I could just dial down the entire template, right, back to 0, which is the original image, and just have it apply a little bit. Or I can go in and look at what it's actually doing. Okay, so it's doing this enhance, I'm going to dial that back a little bit. And I'm going to bring the overall exposure down a little bit. Okay, so one trick in Luminar is if you want to see the histogram, okay, you have to go to View and then Show Histogram. But it's fairly small. If you want to see a bigger one, just open up the curves and you'll see actually the histogram in behind here in the curves layer, okay, in the curves tool. So I'm going to bring the highlights down. And I mentioned this last week, but if you want to see where your highlights are clipping or your shadows, just press the J key on your keyboard and that will give you the clipping warning. So I'm just going to pull the highlights down until I get detail. Okay. Now I could do the same kind of thing here and do it on the curves layer. See how that works? It's the same idea. So I can do a combination of one or the other or both. Okay, so now I've gotten rid of the clipping, so I've got a little more detail. Okay, that's in the light panel. Aha, Holly, I remembered where our profiles are. So this is where the profile is. So yes, it comes with, so it's loaded the camera profile. So it does recognize your camera profiles right here. Okay, and this is your image. So da 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 da. Okay, so sometimes we have happy accident. Vignette. Okay, this is one I actually might change because it's adding a dark edge vignette. And I have a vision of this one being light and airy. So I'm actually going to take it the opposite way. So I'm going to make this a light vignette. Okay, so we can see the shape, the size, and position the subject. Okay, so all of the things like we did before. And put the feather back. Okay, so notice now when I can make it totally white all the way or totally black, right? But I want to lighten, so it makes it sort of the flowers much more pastel. Everything is much more pastel. Okay. Let's see what the mood is doing. We can increase that a little bit. Keep it softer. Let's see what else. Okay, so this one is applying some portrait AI. So I'm just going to actually turn those off because there's no person in here. Okay, because remember I said this was a portrait template, so I can just turn that off. Let's see. We could probably do a little bit of detail in the flower and just paint it into the flower itself ever so slightly. And another trick is that if you take the large details to the left, look what happens to the background. Okay, so these are what's called large details, large blocky areas. Okay, so if I increase the mid-tone sharpness or the medium details, I'm increasing the detail on this petal while decreasing the detail in the background. Okay, see the difference if I change this? It's not doing a whole lot. And I'm going to keep it dialed down. Okay, I can also go in with structure. Okay, so this is something where I actually am going to do a video on making fake bokeh. So if you want to make fake bokeh or blurriness in the background like this, okay, this image already has it, but you can use the structure AI tool inside of Luminar AI and take it to the minus side. Okay, so when I do that, and I'm going to boost it so you can really see, okay, so it's making the whole image really sort of blurry, right? And I want to keep detail on this flower, okay? So to fake a bokeh like this, I'm just going to use the radial mask and make a nice circle over the flower. Okay, gotta expand a little bit, like so. Okay, so now what's happening is the mask is applying to the outside part, or the structure minus structure is applying around the flower, okay, and not to the flower itself. And if I wanted to continue masking, maybe I want a little more of the stem area to have a little bit of sharpness. I could just paint that mask, oops, erase it, pardon me, erase it, not paint it in, like that. Okay, see, that's how easy it is when you make a mistake, just to undo. Okay, so let's see what the structure is doing. So wait for it to catch up. Momentarily. My computer is out of resources. Okay, oops. I'm going to quit Lightroom Classic. One thing I will mention, actually, while I have this on my screen, is that you set up your catalog in Lightroom to make sure that you back up every time Lightroom exits, and that's in your preferences. And make sure that you choose a backup folder that is off the location, not on your main computer. Okay, so I'm not going to back up this one this time, but make sure that you back up every time you exit if you've done a lot of work. Okay, if you've just gone in and looked at your image, don't worry about it so much. Okay. All right, I'm not sure what's happening here. I think I told it to quit. So I'm going to come back here and see if there's any questions. Yes, it's automatic, Holly. So the profiles that were there under the light panel would be related to your camera because it recognized it. Yep. No, you don't have to add it. As long as you see that what I saw when I pulled it down, you should be good. Yep. All right, I'm not sure what's happening here, but I'm just gonna quit. We got too much stuff going on. Let's try it again. So, as I said, if you've got some computer issues, restart, reboot, or worst case scenario, hard turn off your computer and then start it again. Because I find that computers are not infallible, right? And sometimes I want to hit it with a big stick. So let me know what you've learned today. I'm going to come back to that flower. Hopefully I can get that to open. I'm having some issues with that. And give me a second here. I will finish the flower issue. Yes, how's my sound? My mic is over here now. Yes, if the template is not meant for the subject. So, for example, just because a template says people doesn't mean you have to use it on portraits, or just because it says close-ups, you could use it on a landscape, right? I try all kinds of different things. The ones that it's suggesting is based on what it thinks is in your image, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the one that you have to use. Well, I'm having trouble with my computer and getting things back opened again. So I think we may have to call it quits today. Oh, there we go. It's coming. It's coming. There we are. Now it should get us back where we started. What's everybody's beverage of choice today? I've got just water. Depending on where everybody lives, it might be evening. Okay, now we've got the flower back. Right, look how much more color this has than the original. So as soon as it's fully loaded here, I'm going to do a before and after. And I'm going to go down here into this, where was I? All right, structure, that's where I was at. Okay, so I'm going to turn this structure on. Right, oh, did you see what that did? It's not doing a whole lot here, but look at the edge of the stick here on the left, and it's really blurring it out. Because this image is already really blurry, it's not doing a whole lot for this one. Oh, screen share. There we go. Now you can see my screen. Okay, let's try that again. So I'll do a before and after on this one. It's very subtle, like just seeing it in the lower left of this image on the stick. Otherwise, it's not doing a whole lot. But let's do a whole before and after. So that's the original. And just by applying that color, the template, and a whiter vignette or a light vignette, right? So you can see this texture here is the one that has been applied. Oh, I think we lost it. I think we lost our texture. It was under experimental, wasn't it? Yep, glow. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to go back in here and it should have a texture. Okay. So you can see, interesting. There's definitely a texture there. Not sure what it's doing though in this particular image. But I like what's happened in terms of this template and creating the added color around that image. It's really given us, there we go. It's really given us more of those pinks and purples, right? So before and after, right? You can definitely see that there was a lot more detail in the background than there is now. So using details minus and structure minus has really helped that one. So I think now, let me just get over here. So that's all for today. Let me know in the chat what you've learned. If you're enjoying these sessions, keep sending in your images. Yes, my computer did get very tired, and I think it's time for me to have more coffee as well. Rob says more coffee, and Holly as well. So keep sending your images. I love playing with them, and you guys are sending some amazing images. Keep shooting and give the video a thumbs up, and make sure you subscribe to the channel and share it with friends. Get some other people to come and join you in the live. I'd love to have, more people engaged in the chat, because the more questions we have, the more things that you can learn. So until next time, I will see you next week. We're going to change the time next week for an hour earlier. So an hour earlier than we started today, we'll be starting next week. And we may adjust the time a little bit depending on time zones for everybody. But take care, and we'll see you next time 1 hour earlier.